urgent questions about international protection, risk reduction, and migration governance broadly. And we'll be touching on some of those things today, but more specifically, we'll be discussing approaches to policy and institutional responses to displacement related to climate in different ways. And to do that, we're very happy to have a keynote speaker, Walter Kälin. He is a professor emeritus for international and Swiss constitutional law at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And he will share experiences and insights from decades, I think, of work on this topic. So we're really happy to have you here. He has a number of other roles, which you can read about in the event page as well, describing his specific experience as well. But I won't go into the details there and allow him to speak to the topic in a moment. So after we've heard from Walter, we'll also hear from two of my PRIO colleagues, Tone Sommerfeld and Andreas Fore Tollefsen, who will in different ways draw on research insights from PRIO research to do with climate, but also conflict, migration, peace, because these are topics that are all related in different ways to the questions that we're discussing and to matters of international response. My role here primarily will then be to try and keep the time. And I hope that we'll be having time for some questions or comments also from the audience when we get to the end of the prepared presentations. So if you have any questions or comments, please prepare to share those as well. And finally, I've also been asked to apologize to those in the room that it looks like we're slightly messy here. We're not, but we're in the middle of a refurbishment. So we're very happy that we're able to have this event today. We're moving out of the offices here as we speak. So this is the reason for the boxes. And we've tried to still make it very welcoming for you. But if you wonder why there are these boxes, this is this practical reason for that. Okay, so without further ado, I'd just like to pass the floor to you, Walter, and I'll just open your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta, for the warm welcome. Thank you very much, PRIO, for providing me with this opportunity to talk a bit about climate-related human mobility, recent international developments. What you see on the screen is a picture I took in Somalia, people displaced by drought. Of course, it's a country also affected by conflict, but these people here have been displaced by drought. What are we talking about? We're talking about huge numbers. Last year, almost 46 million people were newly displaced in the context of mostly sudden onset disasters. You see this, it changes every year, but on average, it's something like 23, 24 million each year. Some can go back after a relatively short period of time, but others remain in protracted displacement, like the people on the picture I just showed. And very important here in Europe, we're always talking about climate refugees, streams of people coming to Europe. The reality is most are internally displaced persons, remain within their own country. Some cross borders, but we don't have the figures. And if you're looking at the natural hazards, it's mainly weather climate-related events, such as storms, droughts, flooding, etc. It's complex. Of course, there are the sudden onset disasters. The first picture is a village we just lost in Switzerland this summer. Landslide, rock slide, collapsing glacier, weakened by global warming. Sudden onset, that's a picture I took in the Somali region of Ethiopia, drought. Interaction, a picture my wife took on Kiribati, one of the low-lying atoll islands in the Pacific. Weakened area by sea level rise, eroding coastlines, but then a tropical storm gave it the rest. And the last picture in the forefront, you see those who had been displaced by conflict in southwestern Somalia, by Doha, and in the back those I met in 2016 arriving because of drought. We'll hear more about those complexities. But let's looking back at what happened in terms of international responses. We can give a date to the beginning of a real discussion at the international level. This is the COP, the Conference of Parties in Cancun, where states adopted what is called the Cancun Framework on Climate Change Adaptation 2010. It's a very short paragraph. It simply says that states are encouraged to take action to enhance understanding, coordination, cooperation regarding displacement, meaning forced movements, migration, meaning predominantly voluntary movements, and planned relocation in the context of climate change. The question then was where to take it from there. 2011 was 6th-year anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. The High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, who is now the Secretary General, organized during that year activities. One important activity was the so-called Nansen Conference here in Oslo in June 2011, coming out with some general principles. And then the idea was that this would be the start of a discussion within the United Nations. But at the ministerial meeting, UNHCR, organized in December 2011, basically all the states said, no, we don't want to discuss it within the framework of the UN. And this is when Norway and Switzerland stood up, supported by countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, Mexico, and said, let's take it out of the UN process. Let's really start to build consensus bottom up from the regions most affected. And this was the beginning of what is called the Nansen Initiative on Cross-Border Disaster Displacement, launched 2012 by Switzerland and Norway. I was asked to act as the envoy of this chair. And I'm very happy to see Johan Meyer here, who at that time was in charge at your MFA for the Nansen Initiative. What we did was a series of regional consultations in particular affected regions, and all of that served first to build consensus on how to understand the phenomenon, but then also to identify good practices, effective practices. All of that became what is called the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, an agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disasters and climate change. At that time, very much a focus on cross-border movements. It was endorsed by 109 countries. Beginning of this week, 10 years ago, 13th of October. So it's very timely to have this event today here. It presents, as I said, terms, concepts, not climate refugees. Climate as such does not displace people, as I will explain in a moment, even though it is an important driver. But then effective practices to protect people both in the country where they arrive, countries of refuge for those who cross borders. They are not recognized by international law as refugees, so what are the protection possibilities? But then also looking at reducing displacement risks or solving displacement challenges in countries of origin. At that time, Norway and Switzerland decided we have done our job, the UN should take over. But still the UN was hesitant. And this is why Germany and Bangladesh then launched a year later, 2016, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, still working. It's a state-led multi-stakeholder process, focusing on strengthening the protection of people, but also to prevent and reduce displacement risks. And the protection agenda serves as a basis for that work. An intergovernmental platform, north, south, east, west, of interested states. Okay, what's the conceptual understanding we developed in that process? We started at looking at how can you define a disaster. And the international definition we then applied to displacement situations. People have to run when they are exposed to a natural hazard and they do not have the capacity to cope with the impacts. That's when running, fleeing is your only option to save your life, etc., etc. So this already shows that it's really multi-causal, and we will hear more about that during the discussion on the multi-causality. And climate change is exacerbating all the different elements. Storms are becoming stronger, coastal erosions are becoming more frequent, exposure might also be covering a larger geographical area. Like last year, we had lots of drought in the Amazonas area, but much larger than previously. Same with droughts, etc. And it's also exacerbating vulnerability. If you're just barely surviving as a farmer, as a pastoralist in Somalia, and then the drought hits, yes, then food insecurity can quickly turn into famine. So that's the impact of climate, but it's not the climate as such. And you can look at the picture here. A hazard, rain, landslide, exposure. You probably shouldn't build a house there. And the house doesn't have any foundations, so it's displaced. Good. The big advantage of this understanding is that it's opening opportunities, pathways into policy. We can try to reduce the hazard. We can try to reduce the vulnerability. We can try to reduce exposure. So it's a toolbox, helping people to stay, helping them to move out of harm's way, and when this is not working, helping to protect the displaced persons internally across borders. And this is what was happening in the past 10 years at the international level. The Paris Agreement is about reduction of emissions aimed at reducing the hazards. Not very successful, but still some movement. We had 2015 the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction adopted, the Cancun climate change adaptation framework working on these issues, and that's also linked to climate financing. Not sufficient, but still something is happening. And on migration pathways, 2018, the Global Compact on Migration was adopted. It talks in quite some detail about people forced to move in disaster climate change contexts. And on planned relocation, we don't have an international instrument, but several states, like here Fiji with the relocation guidelines, have started to develop frameworks. So on a normative level, on a conceptual level, that's what the international community does, this toolbox approach. And I will come back to that. This is the timeline, Sendai Framework, COP Paris 2015, then the Global Compact on Migration 2018. Very important last element in 2022. Finally, the climate negotiators created a fund, a global fund on loss and damage, and it is recognized that displacement is loss and damage. It's not a way to adapt to climate change, and this needs to be compensated. The fund has little money. Denmark was at the forefront in putting money into it, but again, it's the beginning. It's a movement in the right direction. So what do we have? Did we achieve? When we're looking now at these three pillars, at the different pillars in the climate negotiations, as I said, we have this loss and damage fund. It's a financial pillar, but we also have a technical pillar. It's a so-called Santiago network, providing technical support assistance to affected countries. And again, migration, displacement, planned relocation are covered. And then we have, as the political mechanism, the so-called task force on displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism. That's all very technical. Simply, I want to show we have a architecture now, new, still weak, but it's moving in the right direction. When we're looking at disaster risk reduction, helping people to stay, then we have the Sendai framework, and this has really caught on. In Sendai 2015, it was extremely difficult. Our Nansen Initiative member states, Norway, Switzerland, Bangladesh, Philippines, were pushing hard. It was 5 minutes after midnight the last day when they accepted it. Now it's fully accepted. It's full support. Weak implementation. But many states now have integrated displacement risks into their national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, sometimes superficially. Again, it's moving in the right direction. And looking forward, this disaster risk reduction framework is limited till 2030. So we will start in the next coming years on how to better integrate displacement risks into that instrument. Migration, I've said, people forced to cross borders are not recognized as refugees under the Refugee Convention, but there are different tools. Particularly in the Americas, states have in their national laws things that are called humanitarian visa or temporary protection. And some of these laws explicitly refer to climate change. And the good thing is the states in Central America, South America have already started some years ago, are continuing to harmonize their approaches. It's a process. Then we have some new instruments like bilateral agreements. Australia and Tuvalu, end of 2023, adopted a bilateral treaty providing that every year a certain number of people from Tuvalu can move to Australia, permanently integrate, support for their integration. And this is an example that could be also used in other areas, so to help. Australia also supports Tuvalu in taking measures to adapt, measures to reduce disaster risks, can be any kind from planting mangrove, restoring mangrove forests to seawalls, whatever. Very interestingly, in Africa, in Europe, you all know we have free movement of persons. In Africa, they also have, at sub-regional levels, several of these free movement agreements. In Western Africa, ECOWAS, it is common that during drought, during flooding in the Sahel zone, people move to the big cities at the coastline. IGAD, that's the Horn of Africa now, has an explicit article in its protocol addressing migration, displacement in the context of disasters, climate change. And then we have some elements here in human rights law. Maybe we can come back to that. Internal displacement, not much happening, but some countries have adopted good national instruments, Bangladesh, Vanuatu, guidelines. And interesting now, recently we have judicial judgments. In Colombia, very important judgment saying people displaced not by conflict, but disasters are internally displaced persons that need to be protected. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights this summer gave an advisory opinion on climate emergency, very long chapter on displacement. So, assessment, where are we? The glass is half full. We have important normative frameworks. Very important, we have policy coherence across the silos, migration, climate, disaster risk reduction, etc. And we have some implementation at in some regions and in some countries. But lots of challenges and gaps, half empty glass. Still overall, worldwide, insufficient implementation, huge funding financing gaps. That's probably the biggest challenge right now. Also knowledge gaps. And then internally displaced persons are neglected despite the very large numbers. The focus still is very much on cross-border movements. And with this, thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for this overview. And I think for probably many of us, slightly a history lesson on the developments that have been going on and also preceding efforts before that. And interesting to see that you're also pointing forward. So we'll come back to those discussions, I think, in the panel conversation afterwards. But I'll now invite Andreas to offer some comments, and I'll find your slides for you. Please.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Walter, for excellent presentation and thoughtful insights. I found your emphasis on human mobility in the context of climate change as multi-causal phenomenon particularly useful, and your reminder of the knowledge gaps that we are facing resonates strongly with my own experience as a researcher. So my talk now will focus mostly on reflections from my perspective as a researcher working with climate, but mostly conflict-related migration, and more on the causes and consequences. Much of my work deals with the challenges of studying how crisis, whether conflict or climate, influence migration. And if the same difficulties apply, how do we understand the ways different factors shape people's aspirations and decisions to move? And how can we separate the influence of the specific driver we're interested in, whether it's violence or drought, from the broader web of economic, political, social conditions that shape mobility? These are huge challenges to us as researchers. So one example in a recent PNAS study that I co-authored with people here at PRIO on flood-induced displacement worldwide, we found that even with detailed satellite and statistical data, flood exposure alone explained very little. But we found that displacement outcomes vary dramatically depending on income, governance, conflict conditions, which makes both prediction and, I assume, policy design extremely difficult. And I think these findings speaks directly to Walter's point about these multi-causal explanations and also the knowledge gaps that we are facing. So I have 3 points. So one, conflict alone has very limited predictive power. Our research and much of the broader literature shows that climate alone is a relatively weak predictor of migration just alone and in an isolated way. For example, this paper that was published a couple of years back, Schutt et al., they work on asylum migration to Europe, found that variables like drought and temperature have little explanatory value once political and economic conditions are considered. And also in the lower right, it's difficult for you to see, but this is from our economic project where we survey the reasons for why people leave conflict in South Sudan. We would assume that conflict was the key driver of that migration flow, but actually we found that it was not conflict necessarily, it was the desire to send children to school that was listed as among one of the key drivers of migration decisions. So I think, as Walter said, it's multi-causal. Research and data shows that this is not just a single cause process. The second point is that geography and context matter. And I think Walter said that many of these exposures have become bigger and larger geographically, having larger spatial impacts. And I think this plot here shows drought data. And I think this highlights that we have relatively good data on some of the factors that drive migration, like droughts and climatic conditions and so on. But displacement data remain very limited and uneven, mostly focusing on country level, where people end up, much less on where they migrate from. And this is a huge challenge to trying to understand exactly what are driving them to leave these areas. So I think there is a lot of opportunity in research to link data, to collect better data on migration. that can be integrated together with the data on conflict, local socio-economic conditions, and climate to better understand these complex drivers. So this plot is one attempt to try to collect better data, and I'll try to explain it since it's pretty messy. But each of these lines represent one migration journey out of South Sudan to Uganda, to Rhino Camp, which is located in the northwest of Uganda. The darker shades shows that more people have chosen this particular route. And I think this highlights just kind of the complexity of the migration journeys and the locations they leave from in South Sudan. Again, tying this to why they leave. Why do they leave exactly these locations? Are all of these exposed to the same levels of conflict or climate? This is challenges to us as data. Okay, to us as researchers. The last point, different events, different outcomes. So as Walter highlighted, it's not all climate events lead to the same form of mobility. How far, how long, internal or international. A single storm or flood can cause short-term, short-distance movement, while repeated droughts can gradually push people to leave their land for good. So in research with Andrew Linke at University of Utah, we found that isolated droughts rarely trigger movement and migration, but cumulative exposure, drought after drought, does. Then people abandon their land. So I think it's the repetition of stress, not just a single shock, that undermines livelihoods and forces adaptation through mobility. So the same hazard can yield very different human responses because it's likely in many contexts conditioned on social and political structures as well. So this plot here shows again drought levels at the subnational level in Africa. So red areas are drier and blue are wetter. And then we join this data together with data on land ownership from a dataset called the Afrobarometer. So we can then study how droughts impacted whether land ownership rates changed after drought. And then we saw that repeated droughts had a significant impact on land ownership rates. So conclusion, human mobility, as Walter said, is multi-causal in the context of climate change. And I think this research that we have done so far shows how deeply these different drivers intertwine. But it's also a huge challenge to us as researchers. How can we isolate the effect of conflict versus climate change versus all the other drivers? That's a huge challenge to the research community, which I think is important to take seriously, because we need to better understand this to give also help to the policymakers on how to design better policies. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and really good to get a spatial overview of this in this way. I'll now pass the floor to our other PRIO colleague who's giving comments, Tone Sommerfeld, and I think that we will now also zoom a little bit more in, because this multi-causality, of course, is something that we should understand at different scales and levels, at the bird's eye view, but perhaps also below. So with that, over to you.
Super, thank you very, very much. And thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. I'm an anthropologist and a migration researcher here at PRIO, and my comments draw on long-term fieldwork in coastal inland West Africa, on and off since 1992. And I'm also inspired by some work I have done earlier in Haiti. But I'll focus mostly on coastal inland West Africa now. And hopefully I will complement, as you said, Marta, a bit of Andreas's also comments from a macro perspective, with micro perspectives or experiential and social dimensions of climate-related human mobility. So first on sort of the simplifications of push and pull models. In a recent article in Comparative Migration Studies, push and pull models of migration were referred to as pseudoscience, migration pseudoscience. And the problem, of course, is that they oversimplify mobility by dividing spaces into sending and receiving areas. Climate-related mobility, as our main speaker elaborated on, clearly challenge this binary. So people respond to environmental stressors through dynamic, multi-directional movements, short to long term, seasonal, circular, and strategic. So in inland Gambia, for instance, where I've worked for many, many years, millet and peanut farmers, they adapt to drought and unpredictable rains, and very often badly timed rains, because the rains usually come just when the groundnuts are ready to be picked in the ground, and then they rot. So they adapt to this not only by switching crops, but also by migrating to urban areas and across borders. And these movements are not new, but they are now faster, and they are more frequent, and they are more complex. And people combine rural subsistence with urban wage labor because they wish to stay in agriculture, not necessarily to leave it. And this is an often neglected perspective. So mobility then is not linear, it circulates. And then while Andreas noted gaps in quantitative data, I would add that very much qualitative data is also missing, especially longer term observational research beyond interviews carried out during shorter visits. So we need ethnographic insights into how people actually make these mobility decisions and how they evolve over time. And then one of my a point I raise repeatedly is that, especially in West Africa, but also elsewhere, mobility decisions are often collective or relational. So they are distributed among family members and in social networks. So some migrants migrate, or some people migrate, so that others can stay put and tend crops or livestock, either because of that irregular rainfall or drought has made subsistence difficult, or because of conflict. Whereas others remain to enable others to migrate in the future or in the now. And gender roles are also shifting in this. So young women are increasingly participating in mobility in West Africa, and then this reshapes social structures and adaptation strategies more broadly. And then a point on urbanization and climate vulnerability, because Africa's rapid urbanization is spatializing inequality. So in urban Gambia, for instance, rural migrants often settle in flood-prone, poorly serviced areas, for instance in swamps that once absorbed seasonal rains. Here, climate change doesn't simply cause human mobility, but rural to urban migration contributes to climate vulnerability. So poor migrants become disproportionately exposed to flooding, which illustrates how climate impacts are amplified by political and economic processes. And then a final comment, a final point on anticipatory mobility and the future dimension. Building on Walter's point about planned relocations, climate-related mobility isn't only reactive, it is anticipatory. So in an ambitious research project here at PRIO called Future Migration as Present Fact, which is led by Kälin, we are particularly interested in this future dimension and how future dimensions influence people's practices in the now. And from other crises, we know that people displace themselves based on what they expect will happen in the future. So this future dimension is often overlooked. So it would be wonderful if we could also reflect a bit on how development actors respond to mobility shaped by anticipation and uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tone. And I'd like to now ask our three speakers to please come up to the front. And I've prepared one question that I'd like to start off with, and then I'll keep an eye for questions from you. So I hope you have questions, and I expect the panel would like to talk amongst each other as well. So if you don't have questions, that might happen. So if you do, please make sure to ask them before we run out of time. Thank you all three for really thought-provoking and interesting interventions. I have one very curiosity-driven question for you, Walter, and I'd like to just start off with that, since I can do that. I was very curious about what you mentioned, among other, on the Inter-American Court's decision this summer, And I was wondering whether you might perhaps say a little bit more about what that entails. But also, I know that your background is in law, mine isn't. So allow me to ask you, how important is it? And what is kind of the scope for law and for courts and for these types of institutions of human rights that are very much under pressure, I think, at the moment, in terms of this bigger picture of international responses?
Yeah. Law does play a role, but a role among many, many other roles of many different actors. But of course, one of the key challenges is the question of these people do have rights, but how to protect these rights. And that's what courts can do in terms right now of clarifying, but then probably at later stages also regarding application in individual cases. And let me start, I give you 3 examples. I mentioned the Constitutional Court in Colombia. Colombia has large numbers of internally displaced persons, displaced in the context of conflict, also multi-causal, but that's the broader context. And their good laws do not cover people that are displaced in the context of disasters. So there was an elderly couple flooding in a river. They lost everything. They went to the municipality and said, help us. We have lost everything. Had they been displaced by conflict, they would have gotten some support and even support to find somewhere a solution. They didn't get anything. So complicated, it ended up with Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Courts basically said, these people too have human rights. And that's why to exclude them from the protection system that Colombia has for displaced persons is discriminatory. Order, the municipality has to help. Order, the state has now to adapt their legislation and include these people in their legislation. So that's one way, making an overall framework of protection available to specific persons. Second case, a man from Kiribati, one of the low-lying atoll islands in the Pacific. He was in Australia and they wanted to deport him. And he said, you must not deport me. My life is at risk back home. And this is prohibited under New Zealand, but also international law, the right to life, to deport someone to a situation where his or her life is at risk. The New Zealand court said, yes, that's the rule, but in your case, the danger is not close enough because it's difficult, but we are not yet there. So he brought it up to what is called the UN Human Rights Committee. That's a committee of experts, not a court, but deciding cases regarding the application of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And they said the same thing. Right to life can prohibit to send someone back to the country of origin, but in this case, his life was not at risk. Now, the International Court of Justice this summer adopted what is called an advisory opinion on international law and climate change. And what they said is, yes, this principle is a principle of international law. So now we have the highest world court saying that. What it will mean is that now, not only in Australia, and they have specific legislation, but all over the world, people at risk of being deported back to a climate disaster-affected country have the possibility to claim that their right to life protects them against being sent back. So that's not refugee protection, it's not a refugee status, it's human rights protection. And now I'm coming to your question, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. What the court said in great detail is basically the same, but not only the right to life, but human rights in general, and they go into details, right to housing, right to protection of family, etc., economic, social rights, Again, they set out that these rights provide a framework to protect people at risk, but also being displaced, particularly internally displaced. It's an advisory opinion, but it's now an entry point for domestic courts to develop in detail what it means in reality. So again, movement in the right direction.
Thank you. I haven't seen, I think, any hands, but do wave more clearly if you'd like to ask a question. So I would then like to turn maybe back to Andreas and Tone a little bit openly, but I'll sort of suggest a possible entry point, but feel free to deviate. My sense a little bit, having heard all of you now, and also Walter's really interesting response to my question, is that there seems to be a little bit of a gap between the realities that are seen actually both at the macro level and at the micro level. Would you have any comment on that, or how do you see this in terms of this sort of responses, human rights approaches, and the law, which of course is extremely significant, but then the realities that we see on the ground of what is actually happening in the people's choices in various situations? Andreas, would you like to start, and then Tone?
Yeah, I could start, and I think again complexity makes all of this even more challenging. But I also wanted to tie it a bit with the timing aspect, because especially focusing on anticipation and like why people migrate, why they choose to leave, and aspirations, how that changes over time. Because if we are going to be able to design successful policies, I think also the difficulty now with especially both the macro, but I think also the micro level data that Tone talked about, is that we don't really know what will happen, right? So a lot of the research that we have done have focused on historical data on migration, and historical data on droughts and climatic shocks is very backward looking, tying kind of the exposure to the outcome that people need. But I think also you mentioned like the future, the FUMI project that Jørgen is leading, trying to look at how will people respond into the future. And I think this creates, we have climate models, we have climate scenarios, but these are just scenarios, right? But how will people respond, and how will that affect how we design responses that pretty much looks backward, but we should look more forward. So I think there's a lot about time here, I think, which is challenging.
Yeah, I can piggyback on your point, but I think it's interesting that when you speak to people who, at least I've followed for the past some 25 years, there are often perceptions of about what they have done in the past that deviate from what they actually do in a way, but in the same way you also have similar gaps when it comes to anticipation. So anticipations about and expectations for the future are also shifting, and they are also responsive to what's going on. But I would really want to sort of to hear if this sort of anticipatory dimension of migration, but also of crises, if that sort of plays into policy responses in any way.
Yeah. Yes, I think quite a lot, particularly when we're looking at what's happening in the policy stream of what is called disaster risk reduction or disaster management. This is very much about helping people to stay, particularly also in terms of what do we anticipate from a scientific but a policy perspective, but also what people are anticipating.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then if you do it right, and this requires then community-based planning, basically, and real consultations with communities, then you can factor in these kind of activities. What is needed so that we can stay or that we can move? So it's in that context that anticipation plays a role. But coming back to the role of law, of course, law is never what is, it is what should be. But it provides arguments for what should be. But sometimes law also creates frameworks for what people can do. And I was very interested in what you said about the circular movements and the collective decisions. Some members of the family go basically to the big cities in Western Africa on the Atlantic to look for work, can send back some money. this is only possible in West Africa because of their free movement agreement.
Yes.
If you're Bangladeshi in the Sundarbans at the border to India, then there is a wall.
Yeah.
So these frameworks actually also influence what people can do and help them, for instance, to plan. And particularly when you have these kind of possibilities for free movement in anticipation, then you can take more anticipatory action as a family, as a community. Otherwise, you have to wait till actually you are displaced and then there is no alternative. And it's interesting that the new free movement agreement in the IGAD region, that's the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, etc., their article, and free movement agreements are for economic purposes. Labor should go where there is work. But there they, and we were able to support them in that, they integrated now an article that says people who are moving in anticipation of disasters, and that's mainly drought and flooding, during or in the aftermath, are allowed to enter neighboring countries. And of course, in a disaster, these free movement agreements always require that you have a passport or an ID, and most of these people don't have that. So the article says people who are moving in anticipation of during or the aftermath of disaster days, instead of needing a passport, a document, simply will be registered. So this again opens up spaces for people, for communities to react, be it in anticipation, during or in the aftermath. So in that sense, law does influence options, or they exclude options, close options. So in that sense, it's quite interesting to see what's happening in the regions, in the discussions. And as I said, that's far away from many of the European discussions. Let's have an additional protocol to the Refugee Convention.
Thank you. So maybe to sort of follow up on that a little bit, in a way what you're saying is that good international responses to climate-related migration probably involve free movement agreements. I think that's what I'm hearing what you're saying. I think it makes sense, right?
No, depending on the context, depending on the region, depending on the level of trust between countries. So that's, of course, the negative aspect of the IGAD agreement. Great text, but it hasn't entered into force because too many political tensions between the states. In other countries, or regions, I mentioned Central America, South America, where the approach is a different one. It's the so-called humanitarian visa. And there, in Central America, it's very much based on reciprocity. You have small countries. The tropical storm hits Honduras, but not Costa Rica, vice versa. So they all have an interest. If our people are affected and they are received by another country in the region, that's good for our people. That's why we are ready in such cases also to receive people from other countries. And that's a reality. That's not just on paper. This is happening. And then in the Pacific, that's more difficult. I mean, you cannot cross borders. The next island is 500 kilometers away. So this is classical, typical migration quota. But for people affected by climate change, at risk of climate change. So it's very much different from one region to another what the appropriate instrument is. And it's a mix of tools. It's, again, a legal toolbox.
Thank you. So I've seen one question, and if there are any others, please let me know. But first, maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Hello, my name is Johan Meyer. I was involved in the Nansen Initiative from the beginning to the end, and I'm very happy to see you here, Walter. I'm glad that we could celebrate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the agenda, in a sense. But I have a question for Andreas Forø Tollefsen, and it's related to your first slide, and you said that climate sort of events are a poor predictor of asylum migration, and that's I wonder if that is a circular argument in the sense that, I mean, not many people can claim asylum because of something related to the climate. So they would never say that they are there for climate reasons. They would come up with other arguments. And that's my experience as well from Utlänningsnämnden and other areas where I've been working, that, you know, when you seek asylum, you always use the reasons that are applicable in the country of asylum. So you would never say that you are here for because of natural disasters. So I think there is a sort of a bias in the way people talk about these things. Thank you.
Thanks. Very good question. And I think so. This particular study that I mentioned was a response to another study that was conducted by some German researchers that argued that climate had a huge impact on asylum seeker numbers into Europe. So this study went into the data and looked much more at the kind of sensitivity of the results, and found that the results that the previous study showed that actually climate conditions were a huge driver of asylum seeker was very sensitive to just dropping out a couple of observations, and then the results were no longer significant. So there is a lot of research being done on trying to kind of forecast migration numbers due to climatic conditions. And I think it's, as you say, it's difficult, right? Because how do you measure the actual reason for leaving or not? But I think the way a lot of the quantitative research is working is that they are trying to model kind of how specific forms of climatic conditions affect variation or can explain variation in the migration numbers or the asylum seeker numbers. And so far, at least, a lot of that research has been showing that climatic conditions do not predict very well variation in both migration, like cross-country migration, but also asylum seeker numbers. But I totally agree that if we focus on kind of the argument, asylum seekers and not migration in general, I totally agree. So, but I think it's very useful to have these kind of studies that can try to nuance the picture a bit, because there are some research coming out that tries to paint a picture of very clear correlations. So I think it's very important that we are trying to nuance this picture and do much more like fine-grained research, like Tone is doing on detail on micro level, but also at the geographical level, trying to see why do people leave specific areas while others areas are not showing the same kind of out migration. So nuancing the picture, I think is kind of my takeaway from a lot of the research that has been done, that trying to not go the kind of alarmist way that some are doing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and also Johan, for the question. I think one of the things that we're not, in a way, addressing very well maybe in this seminar is the sort of debate around alarmism in general, especially in connection with climate mobilities. And I think this is because we agree, and I think probably we would even claim that we're right. It isn't that causal, and this is also why Walter stressed that from the outset of the work you've all been doing, climate refugees has not been a very useful term, really. That notwithstanding the fact that, of course, in some extreme cases, people don't have any choice but to flee, and the cause is a disaster. But I think maybe it's also honest for us to reflect the fact that we could have had speakers who would want to, problematize this premise. We've chosen to not do that here for very deliberate reasons. But I'm very grateful for your question, because it also allows us to touch on that. We now have a few minutes left, and I will simply allow you to comment on what you might want to. But if you stick within the general theme of this seminar, that would be very helpful. And I suggest we'll go the reverse order. So Tone, Andreas, and then Walter, you'll have the final word.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this may be slightly on the side, but I think it's pertinent. I mean, you gave us a very clear overview of how the multilateral response started out in 2010. And I won't encourage you to look too far into the crystal ball, but we're talking about currently a crisis of multilateralism, broadly speaking. And at the same time, we mention ECOWAS and IGAD and other regional bodies. I mean, how do you already notice, and how do you notice this sort of crisis of multilateralism in disaster risk reduction policies, and can regional bodies play a more important role? That's, so it's on the side, but I still have to proceed.
Yes, I'll be very short. I think my key kind of thought after this seminar is really like, how can research inform policy making? What would be useful, like from that point of view, that we as researchers could do more of, or what type of research, or in which ways? So I think that's some thoughts I've had.
Let me give you answers to your questions and then one very short final remark. Yes, multilateralism is in deep crisis. The good thing is that at least some regions already have started to do a lot of work. I mentioned some of them, and from our perspective, we're really now investing at regional levels. This is where you can make progress, but not only. Dynamics are so different. I mean, it's very difficult to come up with the same conclusions regarding these movements in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, as compared to the Pacific, for instance. Policy, the entry point, there are few entry points where policy and research are really kind of linked together institutionally, but the IPCC is one element. And the IPCC reports, particular events, then the summaries for policymakers are important. And they always talk about these issues, but in my view, not in a way that is granular enough. I think researchers like you should engage much more with the IPCC process. It's still very much dominated by science. And my last remark is, yes, on the occasion of 10 years of the Announced Initiative Protection Agenda, really highlight how important the role of Norway has been in this process. And also from my personal perspective, thanks to Norway for great support. Without that initiative, I think we wouldn't have been able to bring a group of states together that in all these policy streams really were pushing the agenda, getting their own regional groups on the same page. And in that sense, that's really a good point for the Norwegian, a strong point of Norwegian foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we can take those final words maybe with us. I know that in the audience we have people who are working in the civil society and also in other spheres in the Norwegian society. We need to keep the pressure up, I think, on a focus on these things at a time when there are many other issues, of course, that there's pressure on. But there are things probably that even a small state like Norway can contribute to positively in. And we all know that then our politicians need to hear from us about that. So let's try and contribute to at least keeping the attention on that. And of course, from a research institute perspective, also with a lot of evidence and research going into that, hopefully. So I think with that, I would like to make one final remark, which is very practical. If you've enjoyed this seminar either here or online, please consider signing up to the PRIO update or the PRIO migration updates to hear about future events as well. And also, if you know of someone who might enjoy this as a recording later, it will appear on the website very shortly. And please do circulate it to colleagues and friends who might be interested but missed it live. And with that, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and have a nice day.